Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for being here with us. Thank you for the opportunity to rest and to focus on you. And I ask, Father, that you be with us here today and that you speak through me, and that this isn't my message, this is your message, and that it will touch people's hearts. I love you, Father, Jesus, Spirit. Thank you in advance. Amen. Christmas is a special time of year, and one of the ways it's special is that we're able to celebrate Jesus' birth. But with the idea of celebrating Jesus' birth, we also have to look a little bit later in the story and see the reason why Jesus came, which was his death. And so this isn't going to be a typical Christmas message, but I hope that it still will be a blessing for you, and I hope that it will help you as we enter this Christmas season. And one of the stories that we're going to look at, actually the main illustration that we're going to look at today, is Jesus is being confronted by a group of religious leaders, and they pose to him a challenging question that I like to call the timeline dilemma. And to help illustrate the timeline dilemma, is there some volunteers? And if possible, I would like to get 7 guy volunteers to help me illustrate the timeline dilemma. 7 guys. Do we have 7 brave men? Come on up. Come on up. Come on up. We have 4. 3 more. Come on. Okay. Okay, 1 more. There. All right, we've got it. All right. What's okay? So amongst the 7 of you, organize yourselves with the oldest over here and the youngest over there.
You stay right where you're at.
And while they're doing that, and while they're doing that, for the rest of us, will you turn in your Bibles to the New Testament, and you can pick either Mark or Matthew, because both Mark and Matthew have the same passages in them. Mark chapter 12 is what we're going to put up on the screen, or Matthew 22. And if this isn't correct, it'll be good enough. So that's
I don't think so.
And since we only have one screen working, I hope you'll forgive me for using a little cheat sheet for reading the passage. So Mark chapter 12, verse 18, or if you're in Matthew, it's Matthew 22, verse 23. Then Jesus was approached by some Sadducees, religious leaders who say there is no resurrection from the dead. They posed this question: "Teacher, Moses gave us a law that if a man dies leaving a wife without children, his brother should marry the widow and have a child who will carry on the brother's name. Well, suppose there were 7 brothers. The oldest one married and then died without children. The second brother married the widow, but he also died without children. Then the third brother married her. This continued with all 7 of them, and still there were no children. Last of all, the woman also died. So tell us, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? For all 7 were married to her." I see that there's some competition going on between the brothers. But as we look at the idea, this illustration is fascinating on several levels because, for one, both Mark and Matthew and Luke give the parenthetical or side statement that the religious leaders of the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And so they come posing this question that has to do with the resurrection. And I want to say that it's because the Sadducees had taken this hypothetical illustration and used it to disprove the idea of the resurrection. And so they said, okay, we've got the perfect question to trap Jesus, because we know in the law of Moses, and one of the interesting things that I found out as I did research about this, and about the Sadducees specifically, is that the Sadducees were probably about the most traditional, conservative, religious group in the Jews. They only focused on the writings of Moses. They threw out all of the prophets and all of the other kind of rabbinical writings, and they only focused on the writings of Moses. And in the writings of Moses, there's not anywhere kind of directly relating to the resurrection that they could tell, and so they kind of tossed it out and said, we're only going to focus on what the writings of Moses is. So they were the most traditional conservative group of the time, and they had this kind of hypothetical illustration to say, okay, Moses taught us that if a man dies without having offspring, then his brother is going to carry on his name. So if the 7 of you will step up to the timeline, we'll kind of play this out. Okay, so Vantras gets married, and Vantras dies without any children. I'm sorry, you're going to have to stand back. So step back a couple. And then his wife marries Chris, and unfortunately they weren't able to have any kids, so Chris stepped back. And TJ, sorry buddy, doesn't work for you out for them either. So, and Durbin, not so much. And continuing down the line. And each of them die without having any offspring or heirs. And the Sadducees say, okay, when the resurrection, if the resurrection is even a possibility, comes, like all of these guys are married to her, and so what in the world is going to happen? Because we know that marriage is important. God created marriage from the beginning, but what happens when there's more than one husband for one wife? Because that just doesn't really end up working out so well. So continuing on in verse 24, Jesus replied, your mistake is that you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God. For when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. In this respect, they will be like the angels in heaven. But now, and Jesus kind of takes the idea and digs into the root of it, but now as to whether the dead will be raised, haven't you ever read about this in the writings of Moses? See how he takes and he's like, okay, I'm going to focus it in on the specific part of the scriptures that you hold as being valid. Haven't you ever read about this in the writings of Moses? In the story of the burning bush, long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Jesus is talking, so he is the God of the living, not of the dead. You have made a serious error. And if you're reading in the Matthew version, it adds, when the crowds heard him say this, they were astounded with his teaching. This idea that God is the God of the living and not the dead kind of baffles me in my mind, because one of the things that is a heated issue in Christianity today is the issue about death. What happens when you die? There's 3 kind of main broad categories about what happens. There's the Sadducee view, which some atheists hold to, or predominantly atheism holds to, and that's when you die, that's the end. You had your chance at life, you die, nothing left. Then there's more of the Pharisee belief, which is the idea that when you die, you fall asleep and you await for a resurrection. And this is the view that's held by a lot of the not as mainstream Christian groups. And then there's the kind of the Greek thinking dualistic view, which says that when you die, your spirit continues to live on, or your soul continues to live on. And in this passage is an interesting clue into what the idea of death holds. And one of the fascinating things is, as I've been reading through, and this year I've read through the Gospels, and I read through them chronologically and kind of if a gospel or if multiple gospels share the same event, I would read each of the different accounts. And Luke's account brings in something very interesting because Luke shifts and he has kind of a different angle that he takes Jesus' response to the Pharisees, or to the Sadducees, I should say. And so we're going to read in Luke, and we're going to start in verse 33 to kind of pick up at the tail end of where the Sadducees finish with their illustration, and then we're going to go to verse 40. So Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 33. And this is the Pharisees talking. So tell us, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? For all 7 were married to her. Jesus replied, marriage is for people here on earth, but in the age to come, those worthy of being raised from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and they will never die again. In this respect, they'll be like the angels. They are children of God and children of the resurrection. So one of the key things that Luke brings out, and Luke is writing to a predominantly Greek audience, is that they have ages. And so there's one age that then transitions into the next age that transitions into the next age. And so Luke brings out Jesus' response saying that in the age to come, those worthy of being raised from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage. So Luke is pushing the resurrection into a future, and he's pushing in with that resurrection kind of a way that we can tell whether or not we're actually in the future age, because those worthy of being raised from the dead and having the resurrection will neither marry nor be given in marriage. And since we still have marriage today, then we haven't actually moved forward into this age to come yet. And they will never die again. So this is also talking about the age to come. In this respect, they'll be like the angels, but they are children of God and children of the resurrection. Then continuing in verse 37, this is where it kind of looks a little similar, but Luke throws in an extra phrase here, and see if you can catch it. Starting in 37, but now as to whether the dead will be raised, even Moses proved this when he wrote about the burning bush. Long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, he referred to the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So he is the God of the living, not the dead, for they are all alive to him. For they are all alive to him. That, when I read that, it just baffled my mind, because in our illustration, in the timeline illustration that the Sadducees are posing to prove that there is no resurrection, Jesus flips it all around, and he's saying that actually, in God's eyes, they're all alive. And so if you would step right back up to the timeline, and they're all married to her, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, but in God's eyes, they're all alive. Thank you, guys. And so when I read this idea that they're all alive kind of messed with my mind a little bit, because personally, the idea of sleep makes a lot more logical sense. Because when, I like the idea that, not necessarily the Sadducee view, because I want there to be something after this life. I want to look forward to something, but then the Greek dualistic view doesn't really make a lot of sense in my mind either, because while we're conscious, we're always able to make a choice. And so the most logical, at least in my mind, is this idea of a sleep or a rest that happens between this life and the age to come, using Luke's terminology. But at the same time, this idea that Luke brings out, that to God everybody is alive, that just kind of messes with my mind until I look at it from the perspective of the timeline dilemma that the Sadducees posed. Because life is a little bit like a timeline, especially when you're looking at it from the outside. The closest kind of parallel that I can think of for what we all would be familiar with today would be the idea of a movie. We can take the DVD or Blu-ray, or if we're really old, we remember the VHS or the Beta, or we can take this movie and we can have it on our shelf and we can take it out, we can stick it in the player, we can turn on the TV, and we can watch the movie, but the movie in and of itself is something that has its own timeline. The actors and everybody involved in the movie, by the time it's on your shelf, is long past, they're on to other things. And in some cases, and this is true for a movie that my wife and I watched over Thanksgiving, some of the actors have actually passed on because it was a little bit of an older movie. And so this idea that we have this timeline that we're able to fast forward, rewind, we can look at any part of time in the movie and we can see characters as they're alive. And depending upon the movie or the type of movie, there may even be sections in the movie, little slices of the timeline that some of the characters are alive and some of the characters aren't. And looking at this idea that perhaps maybe from God's perspective, we can understand this timeline dilemma that Jesus can say, to God, they are all alive, because God can take and he can say, all right, we're looking at the past segment and I can see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're alive. I can see exactly kind of all the progression of their life. But we can jump over here to the exile, like those guys are in the past. They're still alive to me because I can always rewind, but I'm able to see in the present here. We can move to Jesus' life and we can continue moving on, but from God's perspective, outside of the timeline, we're able to understand how to God everybody can be alive. This, and kind of processing through and understanding and thinking about this passage made it click in my mind, because it's one of the main passages in the writings of Jesus that a lot of people take and they don't really understand that well, because if you read just at a surface level, Jesus saying, well, to God, everybody's alive, that might give the wrong idea. But today, as we're here today, we have a little slice of the timeline that we're able to influence. There's a whole lot of the timeline that's past us, and we really have no idea how much more of the timeline there is to go. But I want to say that we're probably about right here, maybe here, ideally right here, or maybe even tomorrow. But realistically speaking, we're probably occupying about right here in the timeline. But I'm not necessarily interested in speculating on this, but what I want to bring out with this timeline dilemma is, what are we doing with our timeline? As God looks down on our lives, as God looks down on the timeline of human history, he's looking at each one of us. He's able to see our struggles. He's able to see our triumphs. He's able to grieve with us. He even stepped into the timeline to kind of help us understand what life with God is like. But at the same time, oftentimes as we're focused on our little slice of the timeline, we're easily distracted by the little piece of the timeline. Our little slice of the timeline, from our perspective, seems absolutely huge. But from God's perspective, it's not really that big. And if we're able to kind of step back from our problems, step back from the challenges that are driving us crazy, we're able to say, okay, maybe this isn't as big of a deal as what my brain wants to make it out to be. Maybe this isn't as big of a deal. And as we come into the holidays, specifically, the holidays bring about a completely new set or a completely unique set of challenges and stress and such. For many, the holidays are actually a positive time. We're able to spend time with family. We're able to get together. There's an annual excuse for the kids to visit the parents or the parents to visit the kids, and just for the family to kind of come back together after everybody's grown and gone. But with that, there's also the challenge that it's a built-in annual reminder for those who have lost that there's maybe members of the family that are no longer with us. And so for some, and for many, I would hope that the holidays are a happy time, but at the same time, for many, the holidays are a reminder of what we don't have. But one of the positive, or one of the best ways of looking at this timeline idea that really can be a comfort to us if we're thinking about, or we're having a struggle this holiday season, is that while there may be people who are no longer among us, we can take Luke's words of Jesus to say that to God, they really are still alive. From God's perspective, He's still with them. They very well may be written in the book of life. I don't want to say that everybody is written in the book of life, but it's very well that they may be written in the book of life. And bringing up the book of life, bringing up the book of life, it's one of those other kind of baffling ideas in my mind. And really, what is the book of life? The book of life could be like a timeline, or the book of life could be just a kind of a roster of names. It's hard to tell because when the Bible was being written, there really wasn't a whole lot of other ideas that could move past being just kind of, well, it could be a scroll of life, or it could be a book of life, or it could be a computer file of life, or it could be a movie of life. There's a lot of kind of analogies that they didn't have back then that we have now to help us understand the concept of the book. And so thank you for bringing that up. But in the timeline dilemma, it's helpful to kind of take a step back and looking from the outside, trying to look from God's perspective to understand some of the more challenging ideas in the scripture, especially the challenging idea of death. Because really, it's something that we don't understand. It's something that I don't understand. I'm still learning it. And this is a little bit of where I've kind of come in my journey, one of the passages that I read, and how it's kind of shifted and adjusted my thinking. But as we come into the Christmas season, let's remember that while we occupy a small little section of the timeline, and while we can make the choices to make our little tiny small section of the timeline as good as we can, there's nothing really that we can do to make it as good as what God might want for us. And that's really why Jesus came. That's really why we celebrate this season of Jesus' birth, because we're able to both look at the fact that he came and how baffling and marvelous and just kind of mind-blowing that is, but with his birth we can also remember Jesus came to die. Jesus came to be an offering for us. Jesus came to make a way for us, to be a substitute for us, to have his life cover any life that's in this entire timeline, from all the way in the past to all the way in the future. Jesus offers to say, hey, I'll be your substitute. I'll step in, I'll step alongside you. I'll give you the strength to move forward, but I'll also cover all of the past mistakes, all the past sins. And moving into the Christmas season is also a celebration both of Jesus coming, but also of Jesus dying and and restoring our relationship back to the Father, back to God. And so while it might appear as though talking about death is kind of a little bit morbid for the Christmas season, it's really the entire reason for the Christmas season. But not just death, but the fact that Jesus, both as he was talking to the Pharisees and with his own life, proved that the resurrection can be in our future. So, thank you. The band wants to come up and play.